Backyard Professor Chess videos. Let's do some Ruy Lopez. I've been getting some games together with the Ruy Lopez from the Grandmaster games, and in fact I've been playing some Ruy Lopez online on chess.com and having terrific success with it. So I'm excited to show you several of these games to show us how to play the Ruy with white and the Ruy with black. This comes out of this particular game is from Alexander Alekhine, a young Alexander Alekhine. This was played in 1912 against Rubinstein. This comes from my good friend Paul Powell's book. Paul Powell is a master who is producing an online newsletter helping other chess players become chess masters. It's a really nice little feature. He's written 3 books, they're all on Kindle. My favorite of his so far, and I hope this doesn't upset him, but he just kicked out a new one this week, and it's also very enjoyable. But my favorite is 60 More Memorable Games of Bobby Fischer. You know, the famous 60 games of Bobby Fischer, the 60 memorable games of Bobby Fischer. Well, Powell has done us the wonderful favor of going through another 60 games of Bobby Fischer and giving us the interpretation and the commentary, and it's absolutely awesome. He's just down to earth, really easy to understand. So this is out of his new book, The Rabbit, the Tortoise, and the Gambler. And he's discussing 3 different grandmasters, their games, who has really influenced him. And Rubinstein is certainly one of the greatest. He was an endgame virtuoso. He was the strongest player. He had just come out of 4 tournaments in a row, having won them. Alekhine is just coming to the peak of his powers. So this is going to be a screaming game. You guys would have laughed yourself silly if you'd have watched me yesterday trying to video record this. I tried 3 different times and kept muffing up. Oh dear, the hazards of being a Backyard Professor chess video producer, right? So the typical Ruy Lopez, he brings the bishop up to put the pressure on the knight, and of course, Rubinstein puts the pawn out, and then the bishop comes back to a4. So far, we're on familiar territory here, right? Dropping the bishop back, now he pulls out his knight, again touching this knight and touching this square, and this knight is touching this pawn and touching this square. I say knight, I mean touching the pawn. So these are really important developing moves for control of the center. Alekhine castles, which is proper. And now Rubinstein takes the e4 pawn. Now this particular variation, usually at this point, rather than pushing the knight a second time, he does have his other knight developed, so this is a good variation. This leads to the open Ruy Lopez, what they call the open Ruy Lopez. Usually they'll bring their king or their bishop out to prepare to castle. This is just one extra move in the process, gaining a pawn. And there are ways white can get his pawn back. It's not a crisis at this point. And in fact, Alekhine does the correct move. A lot of us amateurs, and I remember when I first ran across the Ruy Lopez, when this happened, we like to put our pawn here threatening the knight to chase the knight away. But on careful analysis, all of the variations have shown that this is truly an inferior way to do this. This just leads to too many complications unless you're well versed in the Ruy Lopez, and none of us really are. So the proper response is that pawn up to get your pawn back here. And now Rubinstein brings his other pawn up, and he's going to further chase this bishop down. They usually, as black, when you're playing black, through the various opening moves, you usually will pull these pawns out. It is a lot of pawn moves, but you'll chase that bishop back, and then you'll feel free to castle. It's safer that way. It avoids some really silly blunders and traps that can happen to you. And so he pulls the bishop back to b3, and now d5. And he brings his pawn up, protecting his knight, and now you can see that he's going to get his pawn. It's not a big deal. It's just a pawn. And then the d will take the e5. So we're even material. In the open Ruy Lopez, there's a couple of pawns in the center. We've got some decent development. There's not really any direct attacks as such yet. There doesn't need to be. Bishop e6. Whoop. No. Bishop e6. Let me do the right ones here. Mark them off as I go. And now it as white, usually with the Ruy Lopez, because of the nature of the bishops, you want to keep your bishops more or less. I have seen games where they don't. It's not a crisis if you lose a bishop. But this particular bishop, the grandmasters like to keep, so they open this diagonal up with the c3 push because, of course, black has the option of bringing the knight over to a5 and challenging the bishop. And rather than letting it get taken, they would prefer saving it. And now, of course, Rubinstein's going to prepare to castle. Good development. A safe, and this is a conservative move. It's a safe move. I mean, he's not coming up into here or here. Well, he can't here. Well, he can't there either. He's just going to play just enough to castle, and that usually is the proper black repertoire at this point. Alekhine is continuing his development now by bringing his knight out. He is putting the question to the e4 knight of black. And that is typical in the open Ruy Lopez. There's no alarm here. And this is interesting because now Rubinstein, you notice he is challenged here, but rather than responding by taking the knight, he brings this knight over here to c5. This is kind of an interesting move. Usually black will bring the queen knight out here to a5 to challenge this bishop. Here instead, Rubinstein has brought his knight out and has danced over here to c5. Same effect, but you'll notice now on the queen side, rather than having one knight on the queen side, Rubinstein has two here. And he's got a bishop here that can come into this area. So this is a little bit different queenside approach now, isn't it? So Alekhine has to play on his toes, which of course he usually did. Alekhine was always very, very good. And he's challenging the bishop, and Alekhine keeps his bishop. See, that's why he wanted to push the c3 so that he can dodge down here and maintain that bishop. That's very important in many, many different variations. Some variations you don't need the bishop. This one, Alekhine wants it. Now Rubinstein brings his bishop to g4, which is another... this is a more of an aggressive move for black. He is pinning the knight at this point. So the real question is, now he's pinning the knight to the queen, so what do you think Rubinstein is saying to Alekhine? When we see the intricacies of the interrelationships of the various pieces and the squares that they're trying to connect to, this move, bishop to g4, pinning this knight, what's this knight doing? Besides standing there out in the field eating his hay. He's watching this pawn, isn't he? Now it's very interesting that Rubinstein's knight is also watching this pawn. So by pinning this knight, Rubinstein is putting pressure on this pawn. Isn't that interesting how that works? Now, if it was Rubinstein's move and he was to take this pawn, this knight couldn't respond. So that's kind of an interesting development, isn't it? So that's the value of the black. It's a more aggressive move of putting the bishop out here. So now the game is building up. It's building up in pressure, and Alekhine says, okay, let's make your decision. Let's see how serious you are. I'll push h3. And let's make your decision with your bishop. Are you going to take my knight? You're going to move back here. Well, Rubinstein doesn't retreat his bishop. He pulls it, I mean he does, but he keeps it on the H file. So it maintains that pressure down into the white area. He remains developed, and now we have two different sides of the board being played all at once. So see, things can get complicated with this. Alekhine pushes the queen to e1. And now the knight comes back to e6. So we can see pretty solid. Black isn't being overwhelmed. White's not really being overwhelmed either. He's pretty solid. I think because of the aggressive nature of the bishop here, I think the development's fairly even, except I think Rubinstein has at least got equality, if not the advantage here. Now, and we're seeing a lot of knight moves in the Ruy Lopez. This is typical. I know they say as a conventional wisdom, don't move more than one piece one time in the opening and in the development. With the Ruy Lopez, you don't see any slash and dash tactics and attacks from one or the other side, right? The center, it's relatively closed. It's not really totally open. There are a couple of pawns there. So they're, rather than fighting at this point, they're manipulating their places where they want their pieces to go, and this takes a lot of knight moves at times. And that's why you're seeing both Rubinstein is moving his knights all over the flipping place, and now Alekin seems to be moving his knights all over the place. But here's what they're thinking. Alekin, by dodging his knight down here to h2, is going to eventually come up into here and here. This is a knight outpost for a knight. That's a nice outpost if he can get rid of that pawn, right? So they're looking to the king side. At least Alekin is looking to the king side. He's got his bishops posted, really nice influence toward this side. This knight can bump up here to here real quick in just 2 fast moves. Be on the king side. The queen can come up and be over here really fast. So this might be helping Alekin in a king side approach. So that's a really interesting knight move. And now bishop dodges back down to g6. He's kind of keeping his eye on his king side. He wants to keep his king side pawns intact. He doesn't want to have any weaknesses created. You see how they're doing this? And he also wants to challenge this bishop. That bishop, you know, that's a really good diagonal toward the king side. There's no reason really for Rubinstein to let Alekin just have that free slashing diagonal. So he's going to challenge him. And he does take the bishop. Now the question here is, Rubinstein has one of 2 options. Does he take with the f pawn, or does he take with the h pawn? Now there's been a lot of times where you would say, yeah, take with the h pawn, because look at that. If he took it with the h pawn, look at that wonderful open file with that rook. I mean, that's fabulous. That's true. That is fabulous. However, the downside of that is he's not castled yet. Once you castle, if you've opened up the h file, you don't use it for your rook, right? So this is why, the nature of this is why Rubinstein took it with the f. Now when Rubinstein castles, it puts that rook right on that beautiful open f file, doesn't it? So this is why he took it with the f pawn and not the h pawn. This also enables Rubinstein to gain the initiative. Now Rubinstein begins to start calling the shots. Alekin goes to knight b3, and now sure enough, now he's got the double pawns, that's true, and if they could be blockaded back here, that could be problematic for Rubinstein. However, if you have the double pawns and you can begin pushing them, man, that thing becomes a battering ram, doesn't it? It's really a good push. You got it protected with the queen and the bishop, so you don't have to worry about it being taken, and the knight. That's a really good advance, and it gives you kingside space. So that's not bad. That's not bad at all. The other thing this does is it prevents white from going f4. So Rubinstein is going to gain a little kingside space, and it's going to kind of put a small damper on Alekin expanding into that and being able to coordinate his pieces with his pawns better. So that's a very good defensive move. So Alekin does the next best thing. He comes up to bishop e3, which is always a good move. Centralizing your bishops. He has swapped a bishop. See, Alekin doesn't have any bad bishops, and Rubinstein swapped his bad bishop. Most of the pawns are on the white squares. This one does happen to be on a dark square, but he can move that fairly easy, so it's not a crisis. And then Rubinstein will castle. Look how beautiful that rook goes on that open f file. That's fabulous. Now Alekin comes back up here to f3, and there's a question mark here. And if I remember the text right, the text says rather than worrying about this particular, again, another knight move, number one, all of black's pieces are being well poised for a kingside. And white is trying also to make sure his kingside is either safe or else it's mobile so that he can go get Rubinstein's kingside, right? But the black pieces are stronger in a coordinated effort to do a kingside, especially with this open file for black. That's why black is favored. Isn't that interesting? The open file is what gives black the better position. Keep that in mind. You know, I always make a big deal about this in my video games, but I'll tell you what, I have seen this so many times in Grandmaster games. That's the difference between winning and losing in so many instances. They were saying, this pawn here is weak. It's a liability. And Alekin should have been attempting to bolster up the support for this pawn better than he was. However, I mean, how do you do that? Look, you could put your bishop here. But what does that do? Look at Rubinstein's knights. Both knights are hitting down into here. They would trade that bishop off. So, I mean, how do you support the... Yeah, if you move the bishop here, you could have a queen supporting it also. But Alekin's kind of starting to get in a tough spot, you know? The poor guy. So he does manage to get to knight f3. And, of course, Rubinstein is going to bring up his queen. You got to get the queen involved. And so Alekin says, yeah, I agree. Let's put the queen in here. And now, everything is pretty well developed, isn't it? I mean, it's looking pretty good. Everyone's got their position more or less, except for the queen rooks. Neither one of the queen rooks have moved yet. But now look, before you criticize Rubinstein for this, in 1912, he happened to be the strongest player in the world, so I don't know what criticism you could possibly give him. I'm not going to. Recognize one factor. His rooks can come into play much faster and much stronger than Alekin's at this point. And in fact, they do. Rubinstein's next move is pow! Come down there and take that knight on f3 with the rook. Notice the work in the open file. Absolutely. Now, another real easy thing he can do. This rook has really easy access to that f file again. Right? Why would he take a knight with a rook, though? Isn't a rook more valuable than a knight? Yes, it is. But when we look at the board position, there's really a lot of traffic, a lot of stuff in the set. I mean, it's not completely clogged. It's not completely closed off by pawns. But there's a lot of stuff in the center. So it's a semi-closed position. In a semi-closed position, knights would be stronger than rooks. Rooks like the open files. Well, Rubinstein has one. So if he can eliminate one of the better pieces of Alekin in this kind of a position, the knight, then it should give him even a bigger advantage. Besides, after Alekin retakes the rook, which he does, of course, you have to retake the rook, then Rubinstein can take the pawn. Now notice the central power that Rubinstein's beginning to get here. This is, all of the pieces are coordinated really good. He's kind of paralyzing white now in a way. You know, Alekin is moving his queen over to here, and then up to here, and then over to here. There's not a lot of places for her to go. It seems to me like Alekin has been put on the defensive here, and Rubinstein is just steadily marching forward. This is really interesting to see how this works. And now look, Rubinstein brings his other rook right over there on the open file. Now we have some kingside weaknesses. The G2 and H2 are very, very weak right now. So his kingside is being pried open. And unfortunately for poor Alekin, Rubinstein has a great open file going toward it. His pieces are coordinated as such that every one of them can jump into here really, really quick. Whoa. Alekan might be in a little bit of trouble here. Knight comes to d2. And the knight goes to g6. Now, his idea here, either from the e or the g, it's a real fast entrance right down into the kingside with a knight. With coordinating various knights, bishops, queens, and rooks, your knights on these two squares are really well poised to really come and get a good kingside attack really, really fast. So Alekan does what the best he can. He's going to give the central aisle some support. He tries really, really hard. And now look at this. Bishop d4. Now, the square they're fighting for is the f4 square. Right? The pawn is here. The bishop is there. The knight hits f4, the knight hits f4, the rook hits f4, and now he's moved his bishop to hit f4 because he's going to make his entryway into the kingside attack through f4 and h3. f4 is going to be his jumping off point. This is why he's more or less overemphasizing f4. I mean, he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces hitting f4, and f4, of course, is directly at the king. So Alekan is going to be invaded. This is a really tough go for Alekan. He's hitting the king. Well, he can only make the best of a bad situation. He's going to directly claim f4 with his pawn. I mean, there's not a whole lot of other options. And, of course, the knight is immediately going to jump on that. Oh, absolutely. Let's get this going here. You can see the kingside invasion is coming. And Alekan, more or less, now you notice Rubinstein has one more player in here than Alekan does. Alekan's queen rook hasn't had a chance to get in here and set up itself defensively, so Alekan is automatically in a weaker position. This is just basically how it works. Rubinstein has one more very powerful piece in this attack than does Alekan in defending, and therefore, logic dictates if they play their cards right, Rubinstein should win this game. Very interesting. So the knight takes the pawn, and the queen comes down here to f1. She's trying to get in the best defensive position she can get in, and now, of course, knight is going to take h3. Boom, check. He's got it guarded with the queen. His bishop's hitting down into here. His other knight can immediately jump over here to h3 and cover this square and this square. I mean, Alekan is in trouble quick here, isn't he? King comes down to h1. And Rubinstein at this point, he pushed the g4 pawn, and Alekan resigned at this point. But Paul Powell, he noticed that probably a faster way to checkmate the king rather than pushing the pawn. Rubinstein took the slow way. He says, bring the queen to g4. Oh, that is just powerful, isn't it? That is a really, really sensational move. And now let's say that about the only thing white could do is bring the queen up to g2 to try to contest that kind of a power thrust. And then queen to h5. And now you've got him. So this is the interesting thing about playing through the Grandmaster games with the Ruy Lopez. We can see how white can either get thwarted with an attack by black, depending on how you play your pieces. We see the importance of development, not necessarily quick, fast attacking and exchanges in the beginning of the game, but develop your pieces to the ideal squares and then get to the attack or to the defense. So there's your first game on the Ruy Lopez. I'll probably share about a dozen of them with you to show you. And this is one where black won. I've got several where I'll show you where white wins, and they're great games. They're classical games. So anyway, there's your chess game for the day. I hope you have a fun time chess-ercising. I hope you enjoyed eating your bowl of popcorn while you were watching the nut job show you a terrific game. And I will see you in the next video.